Nuclear weapons, an agonizing specter haunting the corridors of geopolitical tension for over 6 decades, more than 60 years ago. A crisis centered on these ultimate instruments of destruction pushed humanity to the very precipice of annihilation. Two superpowers locked in a deadly embrace, a small island nation caught in the crossfire, and the entire world holding its collective breath, paralyzed by fear. The boundary between existence and utter catastrophe narrowed to the width of a single button, a horrifying testament to the stakes involved. What exactly transpired during those harrowing days? In the dawn of the 1960s, a luminous star ascended onto the American political stage. John F. Kennedy, radiating a unique charisma and youthful vigor, became the youngest president ever elected in the history of the United States. But the honeymoon period proved tragically brief. The first severe test of his leadership arrived with brutal swiftness, less than 3 months after his inauguration. The challenge bore the deceptively pastoral name, the Bay of Pigs, Cuba, under the iron fist of Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship throughout the 1950s, was ripe for change. A revolutionary storm gathered momentum, and in January 1959, Fidel Castro and his guerrilla forces triumphantly entered Havana, overthrowing the pro-American regime. With his powerful rhetoric and unwavering vision of an independent, self-reliant Cuba, Castro instantly became a hero to his people. To Washington, however, he represented a profound and growing threat. Castro's sweeping reforms struck directly at the heart of American interests. U.S. corporations hemorrhaged billions of dollars as the new Cuban government seized and nationalized foreign assets, unable to stand idly by. The United States retaliated with crippling economic embargoes, desperately seeking to suffocate the Cuban economy into submission. The tension simmered, reaching a boiling point in April 1961. The newly inaugurated President Kennedy, inheriting a plan conceived under his predecessor, gave the green light to a top-secret CIA operation. The objective was stark and unambiguous: eliminate Fidel Castro. A budget of $13.1 million was allocated. A special paramilitary force, designated Brigade 2506, comprising 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and armed by the CIA, was assembled. On April 17, 1961, under the cover of darkness, they launched their clandestine amphibious landing on the shores of Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs. Washington harbored optimistic expectations of a widespread popular uprising against Castro, anticipating the collapse of his government within a mere 72 hours. But they had committed a fatal miscalculation. Fidel Castro, tipped off and prepared, was waiting. The attempted coup dissolved into a swift and humiliating failure within 3 days. The invasion was crushed. 1,100 mercenaries were captured alive. In a further blow to American prestige, these prisoners were later paraded publicly, symbols of a monumental U.S. blunder for Kennedy. The debacle was not just a stinging blow to his personal credibility. It inadvertently elevated Fidel Castro to the status of a national hero and an international symbol of resistance against American imperialism. Most critically, the failed invasion irrevocably pushed Cuba firmly into the embrace of America's primary adversary on the other side of the globe. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves locked in a protracted, non-shooting conflict known as the Cold War. Avoiding direct military confrontation, they instead engaged in a dangerous global chess match, backing opposing factions in numerous proxy wars across the planet. Each superpower clawed desperately for every inch of influence on the world map. Central to this struggle, casting a long and terrifying shadow, were nuclear weapons. Both nations poured vast resources into expanding their nuclear arsenals, not necessarily for immediate offensive use, but as the ultimate deterrent, a means to intimidate and hold the other hostage through the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Yet, a significant disparity existed. The Soviet Union lagged considerably behind the United States in terms of the sheer number of nuclear warheads and, crucially, the capability to deliver them effectively against American targets. Compounding this imbalance, the United States had already gained a strategic advantage since 1959. American Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles were stationed menacingly close to Soviet borders, 30 in Italy and 15 in Turkey, with a single launch command. These weapons could strike deep into Soviet territory within minutes, a constant, palpable threat hanging over Moscow. Despite this apparent superiority, President Kennedy remained deeply uneasy. The Soviet Union was led by Nikita Khrushchev, a shrewd, seasoned, and intensely ambitious politician. Khrushchev was no novice in the brutal arena of geopolitics. Having survived Stalin's savage purges, he possessed a lifetime of experience navigating the treacherous currents of high-stakes power games. In his eyes, the young, relatively untested Kennedy appeared to be a potentially vulnerable opponent. The disastrous failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion only served to reinforce Khrushchev's assessment. One Soviet advisor famously remarked of Kennedy, "He's too young, intellectual, but not well prepared practically to make decisions in crisis situations." Khrushchev, sensing weakness, felt emboldened. "I know for certain," he reportedly boasted, "that Kennedy doesn't have a strong background and, generally speaking, he doesn't have the courage to stand up to a serious challenge." Khrushchev believed he could push further, take greater risks. And Cuba presented the perfect opportunity. A communist government situated a mere 90 miles off the coast of Florida, led by a figure eager for Soviet protection, offered an unparalleled strategic foothold. More importantly, it was a chance to decisively rebalance the scales of nuclear power, placing Soviet missiles within striking distance of the American heartland, mirroring the threat posed by the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. The small island nation of Cuba was suddenly transformed into a dangerously positioned pawn, poised perilously close to the American king from this point forward. Every move on the geopolitical chessboard carried the potential for unimaginable catastrophe. The world had officially entered a terrifyingly dangerous game. During the seemingly tranquil summer of 1962, life in Washington, Moscow, and Havana proceeded with an air of normalcy. Few were aware that beneath this placid surface, a clandestine storm of immense proportions was gathering force. From the imposing walls of the Kremlin, Khrushchev issued the directive for Operation Anadyr, a highly classified mission to secretly transport and install nuclear missiles in Cuba. Every step demanded meticulous planning and absolute secrecy. If the United States detected the operation prematurely, the entire audacious gamble would collapse. The plan was deliberately given the codename Anadyr, referring to a remote river in Siberia. This calculated misdirection was designed to confuse both Soviet military personnel and Western intelligence agencies, leading them to believe the operation pertained to the Arctic region. Soviet transport vessels, disguised as ordinary civilian freighters, slipped out of Soviet ports. Concealed within their holds were thousands of soldiers and, critically, the components for medium-range IRBM and intermediate-range IRBM ballistic missiles, along with their nuclear warheads. Despite the elaborate deception, suspicions began to surface in Washington. By September 1962, U.S. intelligence noted an unusual increase in Soviet shipping traffic heading towards Cuba. The true, horrifying nature of the cargo remained unknown until October 14. High-altitude photographs captured by a U-2 spy plane flying over western Cuba delivered the irrefutable, chilling evidence. Analysts at the CIA stared in stunned disbelief at the images. Clearly visible on the ground were launch pads for ballistic missiles under construction. These sites, once operational, would possess the capability to launch nuclear strikes against major American cities, including Washington, D.C. and New York, effectively covering nearly half of the continental United States. The truth was stark and terrifying. The Soviet Union was secretly placing offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba. Moscow would soon possess the ability to strike the U.S. mainland with the same terrifying speed and lack of warning that Washington could inflict upon the USSR from its bases in Italy and Turkey. On October 15, the CIA delivered the explosive intelligence briefing to the White House. President Kennedy, absorbing the gravity of the situation, immediately convened an emergency meeting of a select group of his most trusted advisors, formerly known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOMM. This assembly included top military leaders, cabinet secretaries, and foreign policy experts. Each member brought a different perspective, but all shared the profound understanding that the decisions they were about to make could determine the fate of human civilization. Unbeknownst to most participants at the time, Kennedy secretly activated a recording system, capturing every word uttered during these intense deliberations. At 11 a.m. on October 16, EXCOMM gathered for its first tense session. All eyes turned to Secretary of State Dean Rusk as he initiated the meeting with a stark summary of the intelligence findings. A range of potential responses was laid bare, including, ominously, options that considered the possibility of military action potentially leading to the destruction of Cuba itself. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara voiced a critical concern, highlighting the unpredictability factor. If these weapons were to fall into Castro's hands, he questioned, would he possess the restraint not to use them? Opinions clashed violently. No clear consensus emerged on a definitive course of action. The meeting adjourned without a final decision, but with a shared, chilling realization. This was far more than a mere diplomatic crisis. The fundamental question wasn't simply whether the Soviets would withdraw the missiles, but whether the United States possessed the nerve to push the confrontation to the brink of nuclear war. By the morning of October 17, the options presented to Kennedy had crystallized into four main courses of action. 1. Issue a stern ultimatum, warning the Soviets to remove the missiles. 2. Launch immediate, preemptive air strikes against the missile sites, followed by demands upon the Soviet Union. 3. Implement a naval blockade, termed a quarantine to sound less belligerent, around Cuba, cutting off all further military shipments. 4. Execute a full-scale military invasion of Cuba to forcibly remove Castro from power and eliminate the missile threat. Disturbingly, contingency planning for a potential invasion was already well underway. A large-scale military exercise, codenamed Audacious Castro spelled backward, simulating an assault on a Caribbean island ruled by a dictator named Audacious, had coincidentally concluded in the vicinity of Puerto Rico just one day before the missile crisis erupted. Now, all preparations for a genuine invasion were accelerated to the highest level, involving naval forces, air power, special operations units, and intelligence assets. Inside the Pentagon and the White House meeting rooms, the EXCOMM debates continued with fierce intensity. Two distinct factions solidified, the Hawks advocating for immediate military action, primarily air strikes, and the Doves, urging caution and prioritizing diplomatic solutions, or the less confrontational blockade, synthesizing these opposing viewpoints. The concept of a naval quarantine gained traction as a potentially viable middle path, a forceful response short of initiating outright war. designed to halt further Soviet deployments while allowing time for negotiation. Kennedy, however, needed more information, more time to weigh the immense risks. Each passing hour ratcheted up the tension. U-2 reconnaissance flights continued their perilous missions over Cuba, returning with increasingly alarming photographs. The scope of the threat was expanding. Not only were there more missile sites than initially detected, but newer images revealed the presence of longer-range IRB-MIRs, capable of reaching almost any city within the continental United States. The window for a decisive American response felt like it was rapidly closing. On the afternoon of October 18th, Kennedy engaged in a critical, face-to-face meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. The encounter, lasting over 2 hours, proved to be an exercise in frustration and obfuscation. Kennedy pressed Gromyko about Soviet intentions in Cuba. Gromyko skillfully deflected, evaded, and outright lied, assuring the president that Soviet aid was purely defensive in nature. The meeting concluded in a deadlock, achieving nothing beyond reinforcing the palpable tension hanging heavy in the air between the two superpowers, each unwilling to be the first to blink in this high-stakes game of nuclear poker. Gromyko, reporting back to Moscow, interpreted the situation differently. He conveyed his assessment that Washington was deeply unsettled, bordering on panic. From the behavior of Secretary Rusk, his cable read, "One can see how painfully the U.S. leadership is reacting to the fact that the Soviet Union has firmly stood by Cuba." He noted Kennedy masked his emotions more effectively, but spoke about Cuba with deliberate emphasis, clearly weighing every word back in the White House. The prevailing calculation suggested the U.S. had perhaps only 18 hours left to act before the Soviet missile sites became fully operational and capable of launching a devastating nuclear counterstrike. The pressure mounted relentlessly. At 9:45 a.m. on October 19th, General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, opened another tense EXCOMM meeting. Kennedy listened pensively before speaking. The military chiefs, particularly Air Force General Curtis LeMay, were growing impatient, advocating forcefully for immediate air strikes followed by an invasion. LeMay compared Kennedy's cautious approach to the appeasement of Hitler at Munich, a stinging criticism. Kennedy visibly bristled at the constant pressure. Unbeknownst to the hawkish generals demanding swift military action, intelligence estimates now indicated the presence of over 40,000 Soviet troops and technicians already on the ground in Cuba, some equipped with tactical nuclear weapons. A premature American attack could instantly trigger a full-scale war with the Soviet Union, not just a localized conflict in Cuba. The meeting ended. Once again, in stalemate, the generals departed unsatisfied, craving decisive action. Kennedy, however, remained resolute in his caution. Later, confiding in an aide, he vented his frustration. "These brass hats have one great advantage," he remarked grimly. "If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong." October 20th marked a crucial turning point. The National Security Council convened for its 505th meeting. This time, the recording devices were off. Only written minutes documented the proceedings. The options had been narrowed down to essentially two: impose the naval quarantine or launch preemptive air strikes against Cuba. The tide began to turn against the airstrike option. A growing majority argued that an unprovoked attack would cast the United States as the aggressor on the world stage, potentially alienating allies and provoking an uncontrollable Soviet response. Secretary McNamara forcefully advocated for the quarantine, arguing it offered a way to control the situation, apply pressure, and, crucially, avoid triggering an immediate, all-out war. Even the terminology was carefully considered. Blockade sounded like an act of war under international law. Therefore, the administration deliberately chose the term quarantine, a seemingly less aggressive measure aimed at preventing the introduction of offensive weapons. By midday on October 21st, EXCOMM reached its final decision. The naval quarantine would be implemented. The United States would publicly announce its decision on October 22nd. If the Soviet Union refused to back down and remove the missiles, Washington was prepared to escalate, first with airstrikes and ultimately a full-scale invasion. The U.S. military was placed on DEFCON 3 Defense Readiness Condition 3, an elevated state of alert. Only 2 steps remained before reaching DEFCON 1, maximum readiness for nuclear war. Forces worldwide were poised for combat. No one knew for certain what Monday would bring, but everyone understood with chilling clarity that World War III could erupt at any moment. Before making the official announcement, seeking reassurance and counsel, President Kennedy placed a call to his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower. As soon as Kennedy addressed the nation and the world, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles and announcing the quarantine, the Soviet Union reacted immediately. Khrushchev convened an emergency meeting of the Communist Party leadership and top military commanders. From the outset, Khrushchev stressed his position. "We do not want to start a war," he insisted. "We want to threaten and restrain the United States with regard to Cuba." Like Kennedy, Khrushchev desperately wanted to avoid stumbling into a nuclear holocaust. He issued orders for Soviet ships already close to the quarantine line to proceed to Cuban ports, but instructed other vessels carrying military cargo further out to turn back towards the Soviet Union. However, in a letter sent to Kennedy on October 24th, Khrushchev's tone was anything but conciliatory. "Mr. President," he wrote sharply, "you are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands you will use force. Think well about what you are saying. And you want to persuade me to agree to this. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us." Moscow had decided not to directly challenge the quarantine line, thus avoiding an immediate naval confrontation, but crucially, they made no move to dismantle the missile sites already in Cuba simultaneously. For Soviet nuclear-armed submarines were deployed to patrol the waters near the quarantine zone, adding another volatile element to the already explosive situation. Neither superpower showed any sign of yielding. On October 25th, the confrontation shifted to the diplomatic stage at the United Nations. In a dramatic Security Council session, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson directly challenged his Soviet counterpart, Valerian Zorin. Stevenson, typically known for his calm demeanor, began his presentation measuredly. But his voice grew increasingly urgent, his arguments sharper and more pointed as he pressed Zorin to admit the presence of Soviet missiles. "Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba?" Stevenson demanded. "Yes or no?" "Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no," Zorin equivocated. Refusing to answer directly, at that moment, Stevenson delivered the coup de grace, unveiling the U-2 reconnaissance photographs. Blown up for the entire council and the world press to see. The images displayed the undeniable evidence of missile launchers under construction. The Soviet delegation was visibly shaken, exposed and cornered. It was a significant diplomatic victory for the United States at a critical juncture in the crisis. 2 days later, on October 26th, a glimmer of hope emerged. Khrushchev sent a long, emotional, and somewhat rambling letter to Kennedy. In it, he offered a potential path to de-escalation. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba under UN supervision in exchange for the United States lifting the quarantine and providing a public assurance that it would not invade Cuba. It seemed the final knots of the crisis might be untangling. But just as cautious optimism began to surface, the situation took a terrifying turn for the worse. Saturday, October 27th, would forever be etched in history as Black Saturday, the day the world arguably came closest to nuclear annihilation. Early that morning, a second, far more formal and demanding letter arrived from Khrushchev. Transmitted through official channels, its tone was starkly different from the previous day's message. It introduced a new, non-negotiable condition. The US must remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviet missiles being withdrawn from Cuba. This sudden shift baffled EXCOMM. 2 letters, 2 conflicting tones and demands. What was the Soviet Union's true position? Before they could fully analyze the implications, a cascade of alarming incidents began. First, a U.S. spy plane on a routine air sampling mission near Alaska accidentally strayed deep into Soviet airspace over Siberia, triggering Soviet fighter scrambles and frantic communications between Washington and Moscow to avert a catastrophic misunderstanding. Almost simultaneously, far more grave news arrived. Another U-2 reconnaissance plane flying over Cuba had been shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile SAM. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson Jr., was killed instantly. It later emerged that the local Soviet commander had ordered the shoot-down without direct authorization from Khrushchev. Inside EXCOMM, the pressure on Kennedy to retaliate immediately became immense. The Joint Chiefs demanded an air strike against the SAM site, potentially escalating into a wider attack on Cuba the following day. Kennedy, however, resisted the intense pressure for military action, choosing instead to wait, to seek clarification, to avoid an irreversible step. The U.S. military posture was now at DEFCON 2, the highest level of alert short of actual war. Nuclear-armed B-52 bombers were on airborne alert, ready to strike the Soviet Union on a moment's notice. The chain of terrifying events on Black Saturday was still not over. Deep in the Atlantic Ocean, near the quarantine line, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Beale detected a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, designated B-59. Following established protocols to force the submarine to surface for identification, the Beale began dropping small, practice depth charges, intended as signaling devices, not attacks. However, submerged deep beneath the waves, unable to communicate reliably with Moscow, the commanders aboard the B-59 were unaware of the limited intent. They hadn't received communications for days and could easily assume that war had already broken out. The submarine was armed with a special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, under Soviet protocol. Launching this devastating weapon required the unanimous agreement of the 3 senior officers aboard: the captain, Valentin Savitsky, the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, and the flotilla commodore, Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be aboard B-59, under immense stress, believing they might be under attack. Savitsky and Maslenikov reportedly agreed to arm and potentially launch the nuclear torpedo against the American warships. Only Vasily Arkhipov, maintaining extraordinary composure amidst the chaos, argued vehemently against it, refusing to grant his consent. His single act of dissent, his refusal to believe war had started, likely prevented a naval nuclear exchange that could have triggered an uncontrollable escalation. As Black Saturday drew to a close, with the world teetering on the brink, a crucial strategic decision was made within EXCOMM, urged by Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general. They chose to effectively ignore Khrushchev's second, harder-line letter and respond instead to the more conciliatory terms offered in the first letter from Friday. That very night, Robert Kennedy undertook a secret, high-stakes meeting with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in Washington. In this clandestine back-channel negotiation, the final pieces of the resolution fell into place. A deal was struck. The Soviet Union would publicly agree to withdraw its offensive missiles from Cuba under United Nations verification. In return, the United States would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba and lift the quarantine. Crucially, there was also a secret, unwritten understanding. The United States agreed to withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy. However, this withdrawal would occur quietly, sometime later, to avoid the appearance of a direct quid pro quo, which could have undermined NATO solidarity and made Kennedy look weak. Both leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, recognized the need for a way out that allowed both sides to save face while averting catastrophe. They both adhered strictly to the terms of the agreement. The dismantling of the Soviet missile sites in Cuba began almost immediately. The quarantine was lifted. The Soviet ships turned back. The immediate, acute phase of the Cuban Missile Crisis concluded. The world collectively exhaled, stepping back from the abyss. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, though still fraught with tension, entered a new phase, characterized by a grudging acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability. The crisis spurred the establishment of the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communication link designed to prevent future misunderstandings during crises. It also provided momentum for negotiations that eventually led to landmark arms control agreements, like the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, 13 days. Less than 2 weeks, yet they represent the moment when humanity stared most directly into the terrifying maw of nuclear Armageddon. If Kennedy and Khrushchev hadn't possessed the wisdom to pull back from the brink, if Vasily Arkhipov hadn't possessed the courage to refuse a potentially world-ending order, if even one more miscalculation or accident had occurred during those nerve-shattering days, the course of human history might have taken a tragically different, potentially final, turn towards oblivion.